and rehabilitation of Ontario's streams, rivers, and wetlands through education and community action. All that to say is that tonight we're hopefully working on that education portion of our mission, having community members learn a little bit more about our urban wetlands and how we can all work to protect them. Hopefully this is possibly a timely, relevant webinar tonight, as we have been hearing a lot of things in the news recently about some policy changes, specifically things happening with our wetlands. And maybe tonight you'll learn a whole lot more about our urban wetlands and feel ready to be a better advocate towards protecting them and making sure that we keep them protected in the future. I would like to start tonight with a land acknowledgement and acknowledge that the land that Ontario Streams works on is a traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and many bands of Chippewa. We know Indigenous peoples, they were the first stewards of the land, first caretakers of the land. And hopefully today, as participants, we will learn a little bit more about the land that is around us, and that might inspire us to act as better stewards as well. Tonight is also a good time to reflect on how we can all be better allies to our local Indigenous communities and making sure that we are all bringing each other up. Just a little bit more background about Ontario Streams just to give you an idea of the things that we get up to in a given year. 2022 was a very busy year for us. We led many different kinds of stewardship activities and just trying to help improve our local environment. So our team, as well as with volunteers, collected 240 garbage bags full of litter. We planted 7,579 native trees and shrubs over 2.5 hectares. We built 66 habitat enhancement structures, and that was improving over 600 meters of stream riverbanks. I'll get a little bit more details about what exactly a habitat enhancement structure is, but in bare bones, it's helping repair our riverbanks against erosion. We removed 11 detrimental in-stream blockages. So these are just blockages that are created by woody debris, things like fallen tree limbs that just enter a body of water and create a barrier for fish to move back and forth. So we'll come in and slowly remove that barrier so our migrating fish and other fishes can get through. Again, we had a very, very busy year connecting with 2,500 community volunteers through stewardship volunteer opportunities, as well as just general outreach. And we're hoping to meet that many more community members again this year. And we also removed invasive species, specifically European buckthorn, from 0.6 hectares of land across the Greater Toronto area. I didn't mention that, but our work is focused in York Region and Peel Region, areas that are experiencing a lot of urbanization right now, a lot of human development that is in turn having effects on our local environment. We are a small team, as I said. We've got 5 permanent full-time staff, 1 full-time contract staff, 1 casual staff, and 5 seasonal staff that we hire. We will be posting our job posting for our summer staff in the next few weeks or so. So if you know someone who might be interested in joining our team for the summer to help with a lot of this stewardship work, you can check out our website for that job posting in the next few weeks. A watershed is basically the area of land that a single large river touches and all of its little branches. So throughout the Greater Toronto area, we have 9 watersheds, 9 large rivers that then branch out and cover almost all of the Greater Toronto area. And then we additionally have a 9th sort of watershed, which is the waterfront, that dark blue right along the waterfront. And you can see here that the Humber River is the largest of our watersheds here in the Greater Toronto area. And in Vaughan, you're kind of split between 2 watersheds here, being either the Humber River or the Don River there. So somewhere, maybe it's a good opportunity tonight to do some homework and see exactly where, which watershed you live in Vaughan, and give you a better idea of where the water that is near you, how far it branches out, and how the actions that you take in your own home, in your own neighborhood, in your own community could impact this much more area all around the Greater Toronto area. So generally, watersheds will decide which conservation authorities work in an area. So in this case, here in Vaughan, we're looking at the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. That would be maintaining and protecting our habitats throughout Vaughan. And as I said, we've been seeing a lot of changes over time. So this gives us a little bit of an idea here. This is Markham, but I think it's a really great view of how things have changed over the years. I guess if you're familiar with the area, one little, let's see if I can pull out the laser pointer here, but one landmark that we're looking at is Buttonville Airport here. So if you've ever driven or gone along the 404, you can see the airport there. And back in 1985, we're seeing a lot of green space still. So the contrast isn't great on these aerial images, but we're seeing still a lot of farmland all around here. And then just a quick 20 years later or so, we're now seeing all of these neighborhoods. So it gives us time to think about how quickly things can change. And we see all of these rivers that are being impacted or can be impacted by all of these additional humans here. And then if we take just another little look farther, we've got 2021 last year, or I guess 2 years ago now. We've got even more changes, more and more built up, and less of that green space that used to be farmland, but that farmland used to be forests, right? So already back in 1985, we can assume that there's already been so many different land changes, and then from forest to farmland, and then to our newest way of living here, with so many homes and schools and shopping malls being built to accommodate all of these people who, of course, want to live in the Greater Toronto area. There's definitely lots of benefits here, but now we have to accommodate all of these people. So the focus tonight, though, is going to be on wetlands and the wetlands that are here in our urban areas. And a wetland is an area that is either seasonally, so sometimes, or permanently covered by shallow water. So it's not very deep. A wetland, in theory, should be a sort of body of water that you could walk all the way across without getting your hair wet. So generally not much more than a meter deep. Definitely not getting more than 2 meters deep if it's a good, healthy wetland. Wetlands, they are good at holding on to water. They act like a sponge. So that's very helpful to reduce flooding, as well as helping bring back groundwater. So groundwater would be the water that's trapped under rocks underground, and having wetlands will help slowly bring it back up to the surface, which is good at recharging our rivers. So rivers, they're either going to be filled by rainfall, which can be good in natural areas and maybe not as good in our urban areas, thinking about the sorts of things that run off of our roads, off of our sidewalks, into our rivers can cause problems, but we'll get to that later. And the other way would be through groundwater. So that natural upwelling in Vaughan and across the York region, we are over the Oak Ridges Moraine, which is a landform that is a natural, tall landform, right? If we think about driving farther north from Toronto, we go up some elevation there, and this is the landform, the Oak Ridges Moraine, where water naturally wants to flow up to the surface of this large rock form. Another benefit of our wetlands is that the plants that are in wetlands, they like to be wet, of course, and they are able to filter and remove pollutants, contaminants, things that we don't want to see in our environment. And these plants, through their root system, as well as the plant as a whole, can actually clean the water, which would improve the water quality. Again, that's going to have that domino effect of helping improve the water quality for the rivers that these wetlands might feed. Right now, 20% of our species at risk, different kinds of animals such as frogs, turtles, salamanders, these different species at risk depend on wetland habitats. So we've already got this group of animals, these species at risk that are endangered for one reason or another, and 20% of them do require these sorts of wetlands. So if we start to lose some of these wetlands, then that's 1 in 5 of our already endangered animals that are going to experience a little more threats, a little more risks to trying to stabilize those populations. And right now, unfortunately, only about 10% of the original wetlands remain in the Greater Toronto area. So 90% of our wetlands have been lost over the years due to human development, due to agriculture, urbanization, all of these factors where we've come and we've seen the land that we would like to use, and unfortunately have now changed this land for our benefit. So some characteristics that we look for that make a wetland habitat would be having some different kinds of vegetation here. We will see emergent vegetation, and this just means plants that are rooted in the ground. So their roots like to be a little bit wet, but not constantly wet in the wetland. Then we have the submergent vegetation, and these guys here, they like to be underwater. They are very happy there. This would be the equivalent of a seaweed sort of idea that are going to be underground. And then we'll have some different kinds of grasses that will be along the outskirts. It is common in some different kinds of wetlands for there actually to be trees and shrubs. So there's different kinds of wetlands that I'll get to in the next slide. But this is the general idea here of a wetland and the things that we like to see. Just again, that idea of biodiversity, many different kinds of living things in an area add stability to the ecosystem. So we like to see a variety here. And as I said, there are 4 different types of wetlands: marshes, swamps, bogs, and fens. And I will get into each of those in a little more detail. I know that before I got to learning about this, I didn't know that there were different kinds of wetlands. So it's very interesting to kind of understand how important these systems are and how varied they can be, which then leads to very specific animals that require them and specific plants that require these systems. So again, if we start to see more of these disappearing, that will have that cascading effect. So we do want to protect all of these different kinds of wetlands. To start, we have a marsh, and marshes are generally a little bit more shallow, and they will see different water levels depending on different factors. Could be daily differences in water levels, seasonal, so maybe they'll have higher levels in the spring and the fall and then dry out through the summer, or they'll have annual changes. So it just depends on generally the climate that these marshes are in. They receive their water from streams, rain, as well as runoff coming from our roads and as well as agriculture. Marshes generally have a lot of nutrients, but have a neutral pH. We'll learn that some marshes will be a little bit more basic, a little bit more alkaline, and that can affect or cause a different kind of ecosystem. These marshes, they have high levels of biological productivity, which just means that they have a lot going on. They're very functional at having these ecosystems full of different kinds of processes happening. So they are going to be very good at being a carbon sink. So they are going to help with climate change and capture that atmospheric carbon, store them in these wetlands, and they're also going to be doing a lot of photosynthesis as well. So very healthy, productive systems. In terms of some of the plants we might see here, we would see grasses, a rush, kind of like a bulrush or a cattail, lots of shrubs that don't mind getting their roots wet. They'll be nearby. We'll see floating plants like those water lilies, submerged plants that are going to be underwater, mosses, algae, and all of these are very effective in droughts because they're able to hold on to that water for so long that they will be able to keep themselves wet even during a drought, but then they can also get ready and act as this huge sponge during a flood. So very good at retaining that water for a long time and then being ready to take big volumes of water as well. Next up, we have a swamp, and a swamp is different because generally it has larger plants in it, things like trees and shrubs. So usually we're looking at more than 30% of the vegetation being these bigger plants. Just get this for a moment. So we are seeing plants that, again, like to be wet. We can see in this picture, these trees are very tolerant to be wet, and they are going to have a lot of water during the growing season. And sometimes they'll see some standing water outside of that time. But usually in the spring, it's going to be very wet, and then it can fully dry out or more or less dry out during the summer months. We've got 3 different categories here of these swamps. So we can see a thicket swamp, and a thicket is just another word for a shrub. So that's when we see a lot of smaller, bushier, built out shrubs that would basically make it impossible to walk through. That's what we're thinking here. And those shrubs are really great at creating habitat for birds. Some of our wetland birds would be happy to build their nest in there. It keeps them very protected and keeps them very close to food sources. In coniferous swamps, coniferous trees would be our evergreens. So things like cedars, maybe some of the Christmas trees you may have had over the past few weeks. Those are coniferous trees. And these swamps, the coniferous ones, are generally going to have lower nutritional or lower nutrient content. And that is because the needles on our conifer trees, they add a little bit more acid to the system. So if we think about a time where we've walked through a forest with a lot of cedars or other evergreens, there's not a whole lot of other little plants growing up along the ground. And that's because the needles of those trees, they're pretty acidic, which then makes the soil not so nice for anything else to try and grow. So that's kind of a benefit to the coniferous trees. They're getting rid of that competition. But in turn, that would lead to, I guess, a little bit less variety of different kinds of plants in those systems. So they might not have as much nutrients in general. And then we also have a deciduous swamp, and a deciduous tree is any sort of tree that drops its leaves in the fall. So our maples, our oaks, those sorts of things would be deciduous trees. And a deciduous swamp is generally a drier environment. And that's usually because those trees like to actually absorb and use a lot of that water. In this case, with swamps, we usually find them near rivers, and that's pretty helpful because it helps with flooding. So again, when we think about how much snow we might get in the winter and how that can melt very quickly, and then it'll run off of our roads into our rivers, and our rivers can get flooded. It's great to have a swamp nearby because, again, they're going to help absorb a lot of that water and take some of the pressure off of that natural system. Next up, we have a bog, and a bog is a type of peat land, and peat is a kind of soil, and it's basically just decomposed organic materials, which again is just kind of like compost sort of idea, but it can cover a large area of land. We see here that it's much shorter, closer to the ground, right? We're not seeing many plants that are going sky high here. So we end up with a lot of different kinds of mosses in this area. And these mosses, as I mentioned about our marshes, they are good at sequestering carbon. So again, helping mitigate these effects of climate change, getting that atmospheric carbon out of the air and into these plants. So it's very helpful. And because they're these big flat areas, they're fed by precipitation. So things like rain and snow would be what would give these the water that's held inside these bogs. And they are acidic and low in dissolved minerals, and that just relates to the fact that it's peat. It's just not very biologically productive, right? We're seeing just a flat land here with lots of mosses. Smaller, as moss is a smaller plant, it's not going to grow as big as some of those shrubs and trees and bulrushes and all of those different kinds of plants. So just a different change here. But again, like our other wetlands, it's acting as a sponge. Again, with all of that rain and snow, it can very quickly suck all that up, act as a sponge, and help with flooding. And then lastly, we have a fen, and this is a type of that peat land. And here we're seeing they're getting water from other sources, not just precipitation. So again, this might be coming from a river or some natural upwelling in the ground. And this is going to be a little bit more diverse too. Again, we see some taller plants in the background, so we're getting a little bit more variety here, which then leads to more productivity. And they can, as I said, they can support lots of variety in the system. And again, as we've heard before, they're really great at helping with flooding. And because this fen is very diverse, it creates habitat for many different kinds of animals. So those are our 4 different kinds. Maybe the next time you're out for a walk and you see some wetlands, you might have a little think about what you're looking at, and maybe do a little Google search and refer to these different kinds of wetlands and see what you might be looking at. So now that we know a little bit more about these different kinds of wetlands, and we've kind of seen this thread so far throughout the presentation, but there's lots of benefits to wetlands. I'm hearing sirens right now. I hope that's not distracting to you, or hopefully you can't hear them at all. But there's many different benefits to wetlands. There's lots of reasons that we should protect them, as well as restore and rehabilitate the ones that we have, and continue to create more wetlands in addition to protecting our existing wetlands. So one big important thing is increased biodiversity. So biodiversity is the difference of living things, and it's really good to have many different kinds of living things, many different kinds of animals, many different kinds of plants, all in one ecosystem, because it adds stability. So if by chance we lose one kind of animal, one kind of plant, there's still redundancies and support throughout this ecosystem to stay stable. It's less likely to collapse when we have so many different animals and living things contributing to one system to help build it up. Wetlands are also a great habitat for many different kinds of wildlife. As we heard, 20% of the species at risk in Ontario require wetland habitats. So we have these very specialized animals that can only live in wetlands, and there's so many different ways that animals can use a wetland, can live in a wetland, so very important to our species. Wetlands, they are also going to have lead to decreased habitat fragmentation. So habitat fragmentation is when our ecosystems break up and they get farther apart. We're losing this connecting habitat. So wetlands here, they're good at being that in-between habitat between different ecosystems. You might have a forest, and then a wetland, and then the river. So it kind of blends everything together, and it makes it easier for wildlife to move between these different systems and find food and find good homes to live in. So lots of benefits to keeping this all connected. And we'll talk about one big currently protected, or maybe not so currently protected area, and how it is benefiting our different wildlife, but that's a little bit later. We've heard it many, many times tonight, so hopefully if you learn one thing about wetlands, is how great they are for flood management, right? They are just these natural sponges that can hold all of this water, and especially when you think about how built up our cities are. We have all of these roads, all these parking lots, all these sidewalks, where at one point, over 200 years ago, at least, they used to just be naturalized. So our rain could fall down from the sky and straight into the ground. However, now that we have all of this pavement, the water can't get into the ground anymore. And we've now directed it to our storm drains and our sewers. And unfortunately, our natural rivers aren't used to this kind of volume of water or speed of water. So our areas then can very easily get flooded with all of this water that usually would just go seep right back into the ground. So having wetlands around and wetland plants can really benefit our human infrastructure to make sure that we are being safe and having homes that are flooding, our basements aren't flooding. Having these wetlands will take some of that pressure away. We also talked about how these plants, their roots are able to filter and clean water so they can take out things like heavy metals. And some of our wetland plants are good at taking salt out of the water, which we'll get to when we talk about road salts. We talked about wetlands being good at fighting climate change and actually capturing that carbon and holding on to it and getting it out of the atmosphere. And then one little bonus one here is the different recreational opportunities that we have with wetlands. There's many wetlands in the GTA that have boardwalks where you can actually walk around, you can do some bird watching, spending that time in nature, so important for us. And then one extra little piece here that shouldn't be our key reason to protect wetlands, but as a natural infrastructure, wetlands contribute to about $14 billion in economic benefits for Ontarians each year. So that $14 billion, again, we're thinking about protecting our infrastructure from flooding, all of those benefits here that will these environmental benefits that do have a connection to economic benefits too. So that $14 billion, of course, not the only reason we should care, but definitely a big bonus in there too. And what are these threats to our wetlands? So as we started this conversation about land being converted for other uses, right? We started with wetlands and forests and then converted those, drained them for development and agriculture to get the land that we would like to use. The GTA, our cities, our municipalities here, it's somewhere that people want to live, and we're so happy that people have chosen and continue to choose to want to live here. There's definitely a lot of benefits to living in the GTA. However, we have to consider what it does mean for this many humans to live in one area and how to accommodate all these humans and still find balance for our natural systems. Another threat to our wetlands would be invasive species. An invasive species is a living thing that's come from somewhere else in the world, and now it's here and it's causing problems. So we do have some different kinds of wetland plants that were originally in people's backyard ponds that were able to spread out of ponds and into natural systems. And now we have these invasive plants that are taking over our wetlands and hard to control them. One example would be Phragmites, also called common reed. And if you've ever driven down a highway and you see in a ditch these really tall grasses with kind of a flowery, purpley brown, feathery thing at the top, that is a common reed. And those again came from somewhere else in the world, and now they are here. And Phragmites is very tolerant. It does not really care too much about how much water it lives in or how clean that water is. And because it is so tolerant, it's able to compete, to outcompete our native kinds of reeds and grasses. And it is very, very hard to control. There's no quick and easy way to get rid of that Phragmites. So one thing to consider is if you have a garden or you're looking to plant something in the community, try and only buy native plants because the Phragmites is possibly found in some nurseries and plant stores. So just make sure that you're buying native plants for your own gardens and communities. Another issue with wetlands is pollution. While there are a lot of contaminants that the wetland plants can filter and clean, there's some quantities and different kinds that they aren't so good at, which can be harming. our wetlands, as well as just litter in general. When we have so many humans living in one spot, we're bound to have issues with litter and pollution. And as we've seen over the past couple of years, definitely a lot more people trying to get outdoors and experience nature, but that usually comes with a little bit more litter ending up in nature when we have so many people getting outdoors. Climate change is another threat with the extreme weather that is to come, whether it's a lot of drought and a lot of heat waves and hot days that end up taking all of the water out of our wetlands, or on the flip side, seeing more rain and more storms than a wetland can effectively manage. Could be some things to see in the future. And then we also have different kinds of stormwater management infrastructure. So municipalities will put in stormwater ponds. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute or two, but different ways that we are kind of working backwards now. We took out a wetland, we took out natural areas, and now we're trying to get those same benefits with different kinds of human-made infrastructure. And it's not always working as well. And looking back, sometimes it's like, well, we probably should have kept the wetland where it was. But lots of ways that us humans have had impacts and will continue to impact wetlands. But now let's look at some positives here. How are we working to conserve our urban wetlands? So here in Ontario, we have a system where wetlands are designated provincially significant. And we have here in Ontario somewhere between 23 and 29 million hectares of wetlands, which is about 6% of all of the wetlands in the world. So 6%, it sounds like a pretty good number, I would think, right here in Ontario. So we're very lucky to have that here, and we do know that the Great Lakes are the largest body of fresh water in the world, so it kind of makes sense that we do have a good chunk of the wetlands here too. In the province, 2,300 wetlands have been evaluated, and they've been evaluated through a ranking system called the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System. And this is a standardized way of assessing wetland function and societal values, those recreational opportunities. And then we are able to share that information, the government is able to share that information with planners to help inform what might happen with these wetlands. And because wetlands are always changing or can change, these evaluations can be amended. All of this to say is that if you've been following the news, there have been changes made to this particular policy and ranking system. I will say Ontario Streams did provide some feedback to the government about the changes being made to the wetland evaluation system. And the government went ahead and approved the policies as they originally intended. And I think that's all I will say, but as it stands, this is still a policy in effect. However, we're unsure exactly what's going to be happening moving forward in keeping these wetlands protected and making sure that they're still marked as provincially significant and that they will still be protected. Unsure at this point. And then kind of to lead into this, in the past, the Green Belt has been considered a protected region here in the Greater Toronto Area. And we can see just how large the Green Belt is and all of these lands that it is protected. And basically, again, if you've heard in the news, it doesn't seem like this will stand as is anymore. Unsure exactly, again, how things will look moving forward. Ontario Streams, of course, is still prioritizing protecting and rehabilitating and making sure that these wetlands will stay healthy. But of course, there's a lot that is out of our control. And again, just on these last two slides, maybe you joined the webinar tonight to learn a little bit more about wetlands. Maybe you didn't know too much about them until you've heard some things in the news. And hopefully this will give you a little bit more information and help you better speak to this to friends and family and your community, which might then inspire you to talk to politicians and other other leaders in the community to help make sure that we are fighting to protect these very sensitive habitats. Beyond those two ways that wetlands are protected would be some other government regulations. So there are municipal bylaws, and I'll get into a little bit more of that on the next slide. But there's also the Endangered Species Act, which is a provincial government policy, and then the Species at Risk Act, which is a federal government policy, and both of those look to protect both the living things as well as their habitat. So whether it's an animal or a plant, and the habitat that that animal or plant or other different living things rely on. We have the provincial wetland offsetting policy. I'm not sure where that stands right now either, because the offsetting is the idea of when you decide to develop a current wetland and take that away from the environment, then you would be putting in a new wetland elsewhere. So I think that's still something that we might see some more updates about Bill 23 on. And then there's also the provincial minister's zoning orders, which I think are also undergoing changes or have undergone changes. So different things happening here. But municipalities, including Vaughan, they have some different bylaws and policies and plans for municipal stormwater management. And in Vaughan, there's over 22,000 catch basins. So a catch basin is this little grate that you would see on the road on the left there. And there's over 150 stormwater ponds, and that's what we're seeing being constructed on the right. Basically a stormwater pond, like I said, if we have taken away a wetland, we're losing that value of stormwater management. So now we have to build something new to help fill that gap. So you'll see with many new developments, new neighborhoods, you'll see often a nice little green area with a big pond in it. And that would be a man-made pond, a human-made pond put in place to try and capture some of this water coming off of all of these new roads and parking lots and all of this to help capture some of that and take a little pressure off or give a little bit of lag time between when that water enters our nearby rivers so that we don't see as much flooding. And then in Vaughan, there's also over 150 kilometers of natural river systems. So we talked about those big watersheds, but just in Vaughan alone, we've got 150 kilometers of rivers. So that's pretty nice. One thing to note though, with both our storm drains, our catch basins, as well as our stormwater ponds, is that this water is not cleaned or treated before it goes back into the environment. So anything that it picks up in our neighborhoods, on our streets, goes into that drain, into that pond, and then into our rivers. So just something to think about the next time you're putting road salt or washing your car with chemicals, just things to consider. So we talked about kind of these policy ideas, but what sort of actions are being taken specifically by Ontario Streams? So as I said, we're a small charity and we do a lot of work right here in York Region trying to improve and protect our local ecosystems, specifically our aquatic ecosystems. And one of our biggest projects was building a wetland. And this here is Newberry Park, if you're familiar with Richmond Hill. This is this is at Leslie and Elgin Mills, I think. Forgot off the top of my head, but this area here, we can see back in 2007, it was a sports complex. We've got baseball diamonds, soccer fields, all in this nice big green space. And then that blue line, a little bit hard to see, but that is part of the Rouge River running through there. And this area is located on the Oak Ridges Moraine, which I talked about before, where we see a lot of natural upwelling, where water that was underground is just brought up to the surface. And what was happening here is that this sports complex kept getting flooded all the time. They couldn't even use the soccer fields because it was just a big wet field, not very good for soccer. And so back in 2001, Ontario Stream started working with the city of Richmond Hill, as well as the provincial government, to try and rebuild this area and turn it into something that was going to be more beneficial to the neighborhood as well as to the environment. So we ended up building this wetland here, creating this wetland, and we've got, I think, 5 or 6 different little wetland pockets here, each serving its own little unique environment, its own unique purpose here. So this is just over the course of 9 years between these 2 photos. You can really see this big change of what this used to look like. And then here we have, again, before this soccer field saying closed, as it was almost always closed. And then now it is this beautiful wetland. So this is basically it took 2 years, because so we finished the work in 2009, or the original work in 2009, but we do go back most years and keep adding more wetland plants. So again, here we see some of these reeds, bulrushes and whatnot, and whenever we go there, we see lots of different kinds of birds using the area. We see turtles sometimes. So even though we're right in the middle of this neighborhood in Richmond Hill, there's still a lot of wildlife here. We also do wetland restoration. So in this case, there's already an existing wetland, and how can we improve it? So these here are the Rouge marshes, so down in Scarborough on Lake Ontario, and we began this work back in 1998. We can see we've just got this kind of empty parking lot, and then our marsh is right here, but it doesn't look very marshy. It looks kind of more like a pond. So we came in and we worked with some partners, including Parks Canada, and basically we worked on regrading the shoreline, so making the shoreline a little bit more softer, a little more sloped going in there. We helped remove invasive species and garbage. We planted lots of native wetland vegetation, lots of native wetland plants. We installed bird boxes, osprey nesting platforms, and lots of turtle basking logs to encourage all of this wildlife to keep coming here. And I was just there last winter, and again, we see that we still got lots of plants around, and they are actually doing some work. I think they just finished some work on this parking lot again, just last fall. So some more upgrades there, and again, it's a really nice area, so much wildlife to be seen. And then just on the other side, we've got Lake Ontario. So we've got this wetland here that's going to be cleaning and filtering water before it enters Lake Ontario. One of the biggest things that we do at Ontario Streams, it takes up most of our summer, is working on erosion control. And erosion is what happens when we have these huge volumes of water coming off of our roads into our storm drains, and then connected directly into our rivers. So we have a lot of water moving very quickly after whether it's a rainstorm or a snowstorm that's melting, and all of this water is moving so fast, it's like a power washer, and it just carves out our riverbanks. So we see on this side here, all of this shadowy area underneath that should be full of soil. But instead, that water came through so quickly, it took out all of the soil, and now we have all of these roots that have nothing to grow into, and then this becomes very unstable. That'll collapse, and these trees can fall over. Not great. So what we do at Ontario Streams, and like I said at the beginning, we built 66 of these this year, which covered over 600 meters of our riverbanks. But we come and we will stick donated live Christmas trees into the riverbank. So anywhere where we see these big gaps, we will stick these Christmas trees in there and then secure them to the riverbank. And what we are doing here is we're creating all these little hidey holes and places where sand and soil in the river can refill and rebuild that bank. So over time, what we see is this big gap. It's really this big scar, basically. We've got all of this plants that have nowhere to put their roots, and we come and we stick these plants in here, we secure them down. And then this is just 2 years later, where we have, again, whatever sand and soil would be naturally in this water, and that would have been carved out of that bank, and now it's existing in the water. It has somewhere to settle, and it will go and hide in all of these holes and crevices in these trees. And then once there's lots of sand and soil built up there, the natural plants that are already on the riverbank can reestablish, and then their roots are going to be able to hold that soil where it is to prevent future erosion. So this is a really big thing that we do to help our rivers, and it's very effective and has positive impacts pretty quickly as well. I talked about removing detrimental blockages. So a question I've heard before is like, what happens in nature, right? If you were at Algonquin Park, right? You wouldn't touch a whole bunch of sticks that are in our river, right? It would be a natural occurrence. But again, because so much of our neighborhoods are built up in all of this pavement, we end up having a larger floodplain, a larger area where our rivers will flood, and that picks up so much more fallen branches and puts them into the river. Out in a nice pristine environment, we wouldn't be seeing so many issues with that. And yes, another big storm would naturally just push that along out in pristine nature. However, the next big storm here in the GTA would just cause even more branches to end up in the stream, even more of a block being created. So we will come in, and over the course of a few hours, we will take all of these branches out of the river slowly, because there's often garbage as well as sand and soil built up in there. We don't want to just let all of that flow into the river. We want to do it slowly so it has time for the river to clear itself. And we'll pick out all of that garbage and put it into garbage bags. And then as we move all of those branches, we get them far away from the river so that the next time we see a big storm, they're farther from the river and hopefully not going to enter the river again. So now we've got this nice flowing river that fish can make their way up and down. We also are working to improve water quality. So a big chunk of that is through collecting litter and garbage. So like I said, this past year was 270 garbage bags of litter that we are collecting in our rivers or near our rivers along the riverbanks. So a lot of garbage can be found, unfortunately, in and near our rivers. And when we are working in the rivers, we're also careful not to let more sand and soil enter the river. So we use this homemade device called a sediment fence. Sediment, that's another word for the sand and the soil in the rivers. And when we are working in there, we're stomping around, we're kicking up all of this sand and soil at the bottom of our river. And when the water is unclear, it's hard for fish like salmon to catch their prey. They need very clear water. So when we're working, we don't want to cause any more problems. So we'll put up this fence. It's got a pool noodle on the top, and then it's weighted along the bottom with a chain. And then this black piece is a kind of filter fabric. So you can see, even though we're moving around and ending up kicking up a lot of the sand at the bottom of the river, it's not getting out into the main river and causing any problems here. This was already a high flow situation, so there's already a lot of soil and sand moving just naturally through the water. So maybe not a very effective day for the soil, for the sediment fence. But the idea is that, while we are improving these rivers, we don't want to be causing any more additional issues. We also do invasive species management. So this here is common buckthorn. It is an invasive species that came over here from Europe. It came with the European settlers. They wanted something that reminded them of home, so they brought it over here with them. And the problem is that these berries are very low nutritional values. So we have all of our migrating birds who eat this like candy and then try to fly south for the winter. And they have a very hard time having the energy to make that migration. So we will pull it up, we'll get rid of it. And then once we clear an area, we come back and we will plant native trees and shrubs in that area to provide the right healthy food for the animals. Like I said, this past year, we planted almost 8,000 native trees and shrubs. That's one of the biggest years in a long time for us, and we're hoping to hit that again this year too. So what can we do to protect our local wetlands? I talked a little bit about our invasive species earlier. Here's a picture of Phragmites. So again, you can think to a time where you've been to a wetland or driving on the side of the road, these really tall, feathery plants here. And again, very hard to control once they're out there. And then another one here is the red-eared slider. So it's a kind of turtle. It's native to the Missouri River. And these guys are a very common pet turtle. And unfortunately, many people don't realize that a pet turtle could outlive you if you get it when you're like 10 years old. They can live for a very long time. And if we had a pet cat or dog that we no longer wanted, we would not just release it into the wilderness, we would take it to the shelter. However, people go for a walk in a wetland, they see native turtles out there and they say, well, I don't want my turtle anymore. I'm sure it would be really happy out there with all of those native turtles. And unfortunately, like Phragmites, red-eared sliders, they're not very picky. They are happy to live in different kinds of conditions that other more picky animals wouldn't, which makes them very good at distributing themselves across Ontario. And they will outcompete for food and for habitat space. So just a good reminder that if you know someone who's thinking about getting a pet turtle, they might want to really do some research and make sure they're ready to make that kind of commitment. And if they no longer want that pet turtle, then and take it to a shelter. We talked a little bit about this earlier, being careful about what ends up in nature. We don't want litter in nature. We don't want road salts. At this time of year, we can be thinking about how to use less road salts. You really only need 1 tablespoon per meter squared. So really think about your community and how much salt you really actually need, and maybe think about some alternatives. Maybe gravel or some natural kitty litter might do the same thing. And just avoid using chemicals in your home or around your community, because like we said, those storm drains in our communities, that water is not cleaned before it gets out into nature. We know our 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, but we've got 2 new layers, rethink and refuse. So we want to make sure that we are taking time to think about things that we can do that are better for the environment. And then we also want to refuse those things that are not good for the environment. 2 very important new steps to really try and incorporate. It's still very early in the year, so maybe you're still thinking about a New Year's resolution. So maybe one of these, rethinking and refusing and incorporating those into your daily life, might be a good idea, a good time to set some intentions for this year. I don't think we're voting this year, but you can always vote with your dollar and be an informed consumer. There's ways that we can learn more about the seafood that we're buying at the grocery store. There's an app called Seafood Watch, and that'll help you learn whether your seafood is sustainably harvested. And maybe if it's not so sustainably harvested, then we can find some alternatives, and the app will tell you maybe something you could try instead. It's also something that is coming up pretty new in the research, is that every time we wash our clothes, little fibers are falling off and going down the drain. And these fibers are often not caught through any of our storm or our municipal water treatment. And now we have these little fibers in our natural bodies of water. The issue here is that these fibers are made with plastic. So if we check our labels and we see things like polyester or acrylic, that's just code for plastic. And so every time we wash those clothes, teeny tiny pieces of plastic are falling off, going down the drain and getting into our rivers and our lakes. So we want to be careful. And again, maybe this is your New Year's resolution to not buy any synthetic fibers this year. Thinking about, can I buy cotton instead? Can I buy linen instead? Can I even buy secondhand and try and extend the life of products that are already out there? So lots of things to consider here to make sure that we're showing how important products are that are well made and are in line with our own values. I'm sure I don't need to tell you all this, but it's always important to be thinking about saving water and energy. The average Canadian uses about 230 liters of water every single day. And so sometimes that's a big number and hard to see, but there's a lot of water that we are using, with about a third of that going towards our bath or shower. So again, early in the year, maybe you want to set a New Year's resolution of cutting down your shower time. Really, you probably only need about 7 minutes in the shower. That's plenty of time to get everything you need done. And maybe that's your goal for this year, to try and save a little bit more water. Or maybe your goal will be only do a load of laundry if you have a full load, and same with the dishwasher if you have a dishwasher. Lastly, I encourage you to keep learning. So we do have another webinar in this kind of series with Vaughan Public Library. The next one will be focusing on urban rivers on February 21st. I also have 2 book selections here that you might be interested in looking for at the library. The Death and Life of the Great Lakes, a real local focus here on our Great Lakes, and some of the things going on here. And then a really great book that I read last year, The Environmental Impact You Didn't Know You Have, all about inconspicuous consumption. So I found that was a very easy and open read, just to learn about how every aspect of our life has an environmental impact, and think about the ways that we can maybe change certain pieces of our life to decrease that impact we have. York Region also has lots of programs and resources on their website, so you can go check that out. And I encourage you to support your local conservation organizations. So as I mentioned, or as Rachel said at the beginning, Ontario Streams does have volunteer opportunities. We are hoping to have an Earth Day tree planting event, our first one in a few years, that's open to the public. So you can keep an eye on our social medias, which I'll share in just a moment, for more information about that. It will likely be in York Region, likely either Markham or Richmond Hill, to be determined in the next few weeks. And then, as I said, we are an environmental charity, so maybe tonight you've been a little bit inspired and would like to support us through a donation, which could be made through Canada Helps on their website. We've got a profile there. We are on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn as well, at Ontario Streams. And if you've got any questions or want to connect with me afterwards, my email is there, outreach@ontariostreams.on.ca, as well as our website too. And I think we'll go to the chat to see what's there.
Thank you so much, Kat, for such a passionate presentation. I think you really humanized the topic for everyone. There's one message that was sent to me directly, and it was, do stormwater ponds mimic wetlands? Are they beneficial, or replacing wetlands at even a small percentage?
So I guess the key thing here would be that ideally, we are keeping the existing environmental features. A stormwater pond would be put in place when we are changing the environment to put in all these new neighborhoods and whatnot. So they are trying to mimic. It's hard to know exactly how well they are able to fill that role. One issue that often comes with stormwater ponds, like those red-eared slider turtles, some people will release their goldfish into a stormwater pond. Again, they're walking in their neighborhood, they're looking to maybe say goodbye to their goldfish, and then they plop it into the pond. And the thing with goldfish is that they can grow as big as their container. So when you've got a little 2-gallon tank at home, they're staying pretty small. But there's lots of pictures on the internet where you can see goldfish just getting 2 feet long, and that's causing their own problems too. Goldfish are in the same family as carp, another invasive species that we have here in Ontario. And they're very good at disturbing our wetlands. They look to eat bugs that are in the roots of some of these wetland plants. And then they end up pulling up all these plants, and then we lose those plants that act as a sponge. We lose those plants that are filtering water. So again, they're definitely a step in the right direction compared to not having any sort of human-made infrastructure. But ideally, yes, we are keeping the wetlands that we have.
Thank you. I'm just going to put in the chat as we wait for a couple more questions to come in as well. Both of the books that Kat mentioned can be found in our library system. So I've got links to, oh, I think I did the same one twice. Sorry. Let me do that again. But I'll put links to both of the books in the chat if anyone wants to read up on this topic. Do we have any other questions coming in? Maybe questions about other things that we can do to maintain the current wetlands or, something like that. I don't think I see anything coming in. I think that you delivered such a comprehensive presentation, honestly. It's a topic that I didn't know anything about before or very little, what I read in the news. And so you answered all the questions I didn't know I had. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. And hopefully everyone's learned a little bit more and can work towards taking some more action, right? I didn't talk specifically about that on the things that we can do there at the end, but of course, advocating and communicating about these important ecosystems is very valuable.
Yeah, maybe everyone that attended this session can tell one friend one thing that they learned about today. We've got some thanks in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending our program. And like Kat said, don't forget to sign up for our next session happening in February about healthy urban rivers.
All right, thank you, everyone. Have a great night.